From acclaimed film director Martin Scorsese comes the unforgettable story of Bob Dylan, a living American legend.
I was in a certain arena artistically that no one else had ever been in before, ever, although I might have been wrong about that.
Welcome to Rock Docs, a podcast about music documentaries brought to you by TrebleZine.com. It's an independent music journalism. They've been around for a long time. They're great. I'm going to point you to they've been doing this Treble 100, like their 100 favorite albums. Not surprisingly, our friend who's the subject of our conversation today, Bob Dylan, shows up. Blonde on Blonde shows up as number 14. We'll link to that in the show notes, but check out Liam Green's essay about Blonde on Blonde, which is relevant to the conversation today. So, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew Keats.
And we are joined today by Aaron Callahan, who is the host of the Bob Dylan-related podcast, Infinity Goes Up on Trial. Professor Callahan. Hi, how you doing?
Hello, please don't call me professor. That's my day job.
Just kind of showing some respect.
I appreciate that.
A sort of a Dylan professor of sorts. Or we'll see what you bring to the table here. But we like to let our guests.
That was throwing down the gauntlet just a little bit. What you bring to the table.
Oddly insulting.
Yeah. Well, insulting is a little strong, but we want to. Our expectations are high here.
Yeah.
Come on,
okay.
People have been following along for over 100 episodes of this journey, and they're just waiting for somebody to say something insightful. Finally, get some value out of this. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we politely allow our guests typically to choose the film that they want to discuss, and you wanted to discuss. No Direction Home, Bob Dylan. That's the actual name. A 2005 documentary by our old pal Martin Scorsese, who, in fact, directed the film that was the subject of episode 1 of Rock Docs. And we've gone through some Scorsese stuff and some Dylan stuff, and we'll definitely refer back to that. But I don't know. Sometimes when we start the episodes, Aaron, we'll ask if it's a less well-known artist, like, how did you come to learn about Scott Walker or whatever? That doesn't necessarily really apply to Bob Dylan. But if you have some story where, like, you never heard the word Bob Dylan until you were 30 or something like that, you can definitely share.
No, I feel like I've told this origin story a million times, but my dad, and Henry was shocked to know that he didn't actually give me the Henry Bernstein, that my dad didn't give me the book. It was a loan, but my dad gave me a book of Dylan's lyrics when I was 12 and said, "Take this, brother, may it serve you well." So wow. I came to Dylan through language first. I know that he was played in my childhood, and I remember being fascinated by Tambourine Man, but I love the language. That's how I came to Dylan. Yeah.
Cool. I dig it. Let's see. Well, I'm sure we've all seen this movie more than once. This is like one of the canonical, one of the canonical Rock Docs texts, I would say. But just to kind of set it up here before we get into it, for those who maybe are not familiar or haven't seen it in a while. So this is from 2005, and basically what you have here is sometime in the 90s. 95. Bob Dylan Inc. Jeff Rosen, Bob's longtime consigliere business guy, decided to kind of put together a documentary or start putting together, let's say, material that could be made into a documentary. And he interviews Bob for apparently 10 hours on film. A lot of which is in this, but this is like a 3-hour movie. There's not going to be all 10 hours. And then he went around and interviewed a bunch of other contemporaries. The movie focuses exclusively on up to Bob's motorcycle accident. That's the end of the movie. There's nothing discussed really beyond 1966. And I don't know why that is, but whatever. And so they had some material. They interviewed a bunch of people, many of whom I'm sure we'll discuss. And then I guess it sat around, or they weren't sure what to do. And eventually, one way or the other, they get to our pal Marty Scorsese. They're looking for a director to kind of finish things off, do some more interviews, get some more material, put it all together. They have found some archival material and things like that. And, just like when I'm looking to put a movie together, I contact Martin Scorsese and he says yes. Well, the same thing happened here. He signed on to shape this
Mhm.
film, and that's what he did. So yeah, so it's about a 10-year gestation process, and so it was a little weird when it came out watching it because I was like, wait, like this looks like I didn't know all that, and so it was like in 2005, I was like, wait, this seems like this was filmed years ago. Some of the people who were
Mhm.
interviewed were no longer with us, and
Right.
but anyway, that's kind of the background. So, but more or less, what the film is a linear narrative type documentary hitting more or less the greatest hits of like Bob's life, as an artist and as a person through that period when he, grows up, comes on the scene, becomes Bob Dylan, the person we know and love, and records those first, whatever, 7 albums or whatever that are, canonical classics. And, then he got in a motorcycle accident in 1966, and that was it. Then he never did anything after that, and he's been, happily retired ever since. So, anyway, that's the film that we're dealing with. That's the kind of setup. So, I don't know, Andy, how do we want to attack this one? There's a lot here. There's a lot to go on.
Yeah, I mean, there is, I guess, one stylistic conceit in the picture, which is as they tell the chronological story of Bob Dylan's biographical history, they're jumping forward to the electric tour in '66,
Right.
Mhm.
back and forth. So there's a bit of that sort of back and forth feature, but that front portion, the portion in '66, does not include any context, any talking heads. It's not as though we're telling a story in '66 and we're telling a story 5 years earlier and we're going forward. It's just tell a story, and every once in a while, let's jump forward and see where we're going to end up, and then we go back again.
That's one of the edits I noted, if I can jump in, because I thought it was interesting that opening where it sort of sets up that we have Dylan as the figure, obviously, who's the protagonist, and we read this as a hero's journey, and he's the hero, right? And he even says he's on an odyssey to go home. But then it jumps from that to the 66 tour, which is in color and it's loud, and it's like this is where we're going.
Mhm.
If the end point, as the film shows us, is 66, and then the accident, which is just done on a kind of a title card, and then it goes completely silent in black and white, and it's like there was his that's the beginning point. And I love that edit, that there's no context other than what we're reading from the images and really the music that we're getting.
Yeah, I do feel like that, and I'm trying to remember, but that feels like it's become a very sort of tropey kind of format for a rock doc,
Mm-hmm.
where you get like at the beginning of the movie, what you get is the artist performing live, often in their most famous or most exciting or whatever guise, and then like you smash cut back to like some dusty old town where they grew up or whatever. I'm sure this
Right.
is not the first example of that in this genre, but it is. I think this film helped establish that as like how you start one of these things.
Right. And it's not necessarily Hibbing. It's just like it's almost like any place that's just
Yeah.
bleak and desolate and cold and colorless.
Right. Yeah.
You know?
Like where Bunny Lebowski was from.
Yeah, I think I even think it's more of a trope in biopics.
Mhm.
The first scene,
Yeah.
the cold open at the biggest show they ever played, and
Right.
then we go back to their childhood. Yeah.
But is that the biggest show? I mean, we're just dealing with
No.
yeah.
It's
No, with Bob.
yeah, it's,
Yeah,
no,
no.
not with Bob.
No.
Okay. So we're I think I'm gonna just kind of start by I mean, Aaron, you said you had some hot takes. So I'm gonna start with mine, and then we can kind of go from there.
Okay.
So I was thinking this through. We've done in Rock Docs in this podcast, we've covered 4 documentaries that are like primarily about Bob Dylan. So we've done the Rolling Thunder Review, a Martin Scorsese story or whatever it's called. We've done Don't Look Back, and we've done Both Ends of the Rainbow, which is about which is like mostly interviews with British music critics about Bob's period from 1978 to 1989. And in a way, I feel like this is the least interesting to me of those 4 movies.
Mhm.
Although this is like a, considered a stone cold classic.
But it's
Mhm.
also, I mean, you'd have to agree, it's the most interesting to a median audience.
Yeah. This is
Well,
like
okay, sure,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean, yeah, but I feel like
You are unusual. You're unusual, right? Like I know we all have the Joker Man mindset, but you do have to acknowledge that that is a a term that was coined like 4 years ago.
okay, no, I hear what you're saying. But what I'm trying to say is that I do not know that I could say that this movie, as a movie, has a point of view, other than Bob Dylan is cool, or like,
Yeah, that is
check
that
this
is the,
out, it's Bob Dylan. Like, that is the thesis of this movie. Like, check it out, it's Bob Dylan.
I don't know.
I mean, and maybe in the conversation we'll discover, or you guys have a different take. But to me, it's like a little bit of a, this is a like Wikipedia entry about Bob Dylan, like brought to life, and there's certainly interesting things about it. I'm not saying it sucks, but watching it again, I was just like, what? Like, it almost seems like why did you need Martin Scorsese to do this? Okay,
I feel
go ahead,
like
Aaron. I want to hear your take on that.
Okay, I have a few different ones. So I'll start with, I can't imagine just getting all of the things, the footage, and then having Dylan open his vault and someone saying, make a narrative out of this, right? Make some sense out of this. And I do think that you're right. It's sort of middle. So I teach lit and film, and I taught Chronicles, and then my students watched this, and then I made them watch I'm Not There, and they were like, well, if I didn't have that other source information, I would not understand I'm Not There, to me, which is the best of of all the Dylan films. So I think that you're right. It's sort of a middle brow film for average people who are not Dylan obsessives. So that's one of my takes. The other is that I think if I find a through line here, it is Scorsese, and maybe it's a PBS mission, I'm not sure, but it's American Masters, and so sort of legitimizing Dylan 10 years before he earns a Nobel Prize, of his place in the pantheon of American art. And so in art and culture. And one of the through lines that I found really interesting, and here's the nerd in me, is if we go through, like, this is essentially why Dylan is the most important living artist. And I'm going to make that argument. But the through line of poets of the American voice, from Emerson, who presents the idea in The Poet in 1848, and then Whitman takes it on, and then he assumes the role of the poet of the American democracy. And then if we can follow the thread of Whitman to Dylan, and then that goes directly through Ginsberg. So at like 36 minutes, Ginsberg is reading his poem America, and in it there's a line, I won't write my poem till I'm in the right mind. And so later on, Ginsberg waxes poetically about hard rain, and the line that he feels is the line that makes him cry, and he's passing the torch. And this is just one of the many ways I think Scorsese is putting this stuff together. But he says that he wept because it seemed like the torch had been passed to another generation from earlier Bohemian and Beats illumination and self-empowerment. And then he then says that Dylan is the better poet, essentially. And so I think through this, we're seeing these images and sort of these juxtapositions, where that's, the first one was like 30 minutes in, the other is like an hour later, where he's making that. But you have to pay close attention to see that these are the connections that are being made. Plus there's Kerouac and Ferlinghetti, and he's putting Dylan among them, through just juxtaposition of images or Dylan songs that kind of fit. And so I think that's part of what's going on in a larger context.
Okay, go ahead, Andy.
Well, yeah. I mean, what I was going to say, and I think this rides with that, is that Scorsese's perspective to me, and the thesis of this movie to me, and the reason he chose this period, I think, is that he's arguing that this is the Big Bang period of this stretch is the birth of important popular culture. This is Bob Dylan giving birth to a thing, and and so it's important to trace it. Yes, where he came from, but then through the Greenwich Village period, and then up until the point where it's no longer the birth of it anymore. That's why it ends in 66. In 66, he goes on to do other things. But what Scorsese is fascinated by is this period where he was doing something that had never been done before that would have this lasting significance to the point that you make about its literary value. And I think that's where Scorsese is fascinated by this. And
Mhm.
I think he gathers a bunch of people who are primarily capable of making that case from different perspectives, and they do. I do agree with you, David, though, that he does assemble a massive collection of here's why Bob Dylan's the most interesting person I ever met anecdotes,
Mhm.
all of which are like some of the most interesting stuff in the movie is different, incredibly accomplished and intelligent people being like, yeah, I still don't understand the guy. He's too fascinating for me, you know?
Right.
There's like 10 of those moments in this movie, but in any case, that to me is the perspective of the movie. And I think why Scorsese wanted to do it. And I think why he gave it like the Ken Burns Civil War level treatment that he does, you know?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Like, I agree with what you guys said, like in terms of like what the thesis is, and I guess the couple things that I have to think about are, you know, like Aaron's perspective. Did like was this in doubt in 2004? Like Bob's position vis-a-vis the 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 sequence of quote unquote great American poets, or you
Yes.
know, I mean, yeah, okay, maybe,
But in the
maybe,
Academy,
maybe
because
I
even
was already like on board on that. You know, maybe I was like so Bob pilled already that to
right,
me it was like, well, of course he's like up there with Ginsberg and Whitman and everybody. You know, like that may be just me coming from the perspective like I was on the you know the Bob tip first before I went back and started reading those people. So you know, it was I was that conversation was always happening to me and to people I knew or that I was reading. So
right.
you know, so maybe like this movie was required for academia or the Nobel people or something.
But
But
even
like I don't know that that makes something a better movie. You know what I'm saying?
no, I understand. But again, it's going to initially to a PBS audience, and so there's just a. I think we think of audience too, but to a casual PBS to people who are watching it who aren't Bob Dylan fans, who would think, oh, he's just the guy who sings the songs. They don't realize that maybe they're not in on that. I don't know. I
Yeah,
just
I'm not
but
trying to
but
like treat that audience with contempt or something.
yeah, yeah. But even within the Academy, there was pushback when he was awarded the Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
Which
Okay. Cool.
I
so
also think like you do
look, I'm
actually
gonna
have to
stand for
like,
my people.
No, 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 okay, that's fine. That's what we're. That's the
Yeah,
conversation we're having.
well, I
yeah,
think also like canonizing something actually does require action though too. You
Right.
know, like it
mhm,
like you know, so and this is part of that. Even if I mean, you know, 2005 by 2005 that's like it's not a crazy idea that Bob Dylan was a
right.
great artist, right?
It's post Time Out of Mind, so it's
Yeah.
not 1986, but I'm writing about the 80s now,
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's that.
I mean, I do remember we in a college literature course. I remember I had a professor who loved Bob Dylan, who taught a Dylan poem by way of demonstrating how inferior it was to other poetry, and that was in 2003 or so. And
And
See?
then he watched this movie and he's like, called you up,
uh,
Andy. I was wrong. I'm giving
yeah,
you an A.
yeah, calling you out, Professor Hipsky. Yeah,
Uh, and I'm not trying to bash the movie or whatever. Like, it just may be my own particular perversity that, like, the Rolling Thunder movie, which so many people despise, is like I would watch that 300 times over before I'd watch this again,
well, that is
just
so
because
much
like
more
I'm
fun.
I love
so
that
like
movie.
that's so my thing.
Well,
Right.
Rolling Thunder Review is, and I think this fits in our dialogue here. It's a much more fun movie. It's a better hang by a
Yeah.
lot.
Yes, but even
Yeah,
like Both Ends of the Rainbow, which like is truly demented and like is just like sloppy and half-assed, is somehow I guess that's why I'm more
yeah. I mean,
likely to.
that's
But that's the thing, like I'm more likely to listen to some never-ending tour show from 1992 than I am to like listen to Blonde on Blonde again, like on a given
yeah,
day, just
sure.
because like I've already thoroughly digested that in a way, and it holds less. There's less upside and downside, I guess. I don't know.
But I think that that's something else too that we can say Scorsese, but also David Tedeschi's editing gives us is that part about, where Joan Baez says that he's changing things up every night. And so to your point, and Dylan even says that, the songs are better heard live on any stage at any night rather than what's on the album because it's connecting to the audience. And so that, I mean, what you're saying is given to you in the film, and it's given to people, again, who aren't folks like us who, I have, thanks to Craig Danieloff, every Dylan bootleg on a
Nice.
what is it, 18 terabyte drive that I can just listen, plug in and out of. But I'm just saying, like, so there are people that don't listen to some random show from 92 from the Never Ending Tour. So those people will hear Dylan hopefully say that, or in his Nobel lecture to say, listen to my stuff live or listen to my music, however you listen to it. And maybe there's that through line as well.
I guess the other part of it, the aspect of it is like the canonization of this iteration of Dylan, or like these many fragments of Dylan that go from 61 to 66 in terms of his recording career, like is, inevitably leads to the people who are grumbling at the show that Andy and I went to this summer on the Outlaw Tour. You know what I mean? Because it's not going to be, that like hot shit playing with the Hawks, or any version of what we see in the movie.
Right.
And
He's
the three of us,
the hits.
He's not going to play the hits. It's not going to sound that way, whatever. And like,
right.
I mean, part of what the movie shows, if you're paying attention, of course, is that like, even in that, the classic, most classic, whatever, early to mid 60s versions of Dylan, you get like 300 different guys showing up, and a different person every night. So like that puts it in a continuum, but it does kind of, you can still come away with this thinking like, well, this is what I need to know about Bob Dylan. This is the good stuff, and of course, like you can't help but then push back against that and be like, come on, all right, enough already, let's move on, and so that's the other thing that as a Dylan nerd, I mean, kind of chaps me.
That's probably my unpopular critique of this, is that if he starts out saying he's on an odyssey, it's an incomplete odyssey. And the through line, again, of the thread of going home, which is so beautifully connected throughout the film, it's just, I think that he's missed a mark where he could have had, let me find my notes. But there's just, it's just so limited. And that to me is I'll go back to those notes, but there's monster theory in lit theory. Are we familiar with monster theory?
Monster theory? No.
Yes. Okay. There are 7 theses, and one of them is the monster is born at a cultural moment that where we need the monster. And so and another one is that the monster doesn't die. And so to me, who
is the monster in this metaphor?
The Dylan, this 1960s Dylan identity, this story of Dylan from the 1960s is the monster that doesn't die, because it's the one everyone goes back to. And so I just, and I mean, to Andy's point, saying that like this is the moment where he becomes, where pop culture is born and he's an important figure. That's true. But I also feel like there are so many other things he does and has done through the 70s that are far more interesting.
I mean, those things are more interesting to me too. But I do like,
I understand.
I do think it's like, I do think we are like, even still understating what a minority we are to think that anything that happens outside of this period is in the top 20 most interesting things in Bob Dylan's life. And and that is like a shame to me. I think that is a shame, but like, I also think it is true in the American consciousness. And I think it's probably true in Martin Scorsese's brain.
Maybe. But then like, okay, let me just say, just so people don't think I'm insane. Every single thing that Bob does in this movie, like every piece of music, every performance, kicks ass and is like the greatest thing ever. So I'm not saying it's bad or like we should disregard, Highway 61 or whatever, or something, or the tour he does with whatever version of the Hawks and so forth. Like I'm not, believe me, like no matter how many times I see it, whether it's here or anywhere else, like that footage from that concert or any of the other stuff that's played in this movie, like it makes it hair go up on the back of your head. Like I'm not, the back of your neck. Like I'm not saying I'm like, oh, I'm too cool for this stuff to affect me at all. I'm just saying like, okay. All right. Listen, I don't
It's a
want
fair
to
critique,
I don't
though.
want to litigate this, this point forever. I'm just kind of frame things in terms of as a movie. Like, I don't know, So, all right.
I,
Let's get
I
let's
do, go ahead.
let's get into the good stuff though, because there's so much good stuff, right?
Mhm.
Like,
Yes.
I don't know. This movie is full of stuff that I love.
Yes.
And, I mean, first of all, let's talk about the main character here, Bob, because this is like by far the most you ever get of Bob just speaking clearly somewhat like a human being who speaks English and can put a sentence together in a way that is coherent. And it's wild that you have in this movie maybe 45 minutes of this movie is just Bob talking to the camera, speaking very clearly about his life and kind of being pretty normal about it, I guess. And it's like, who is this guy? Why did he agree to do this?
It's like a lifetime of undermining everyone's expectations gets a payoff here, where he can actually just talk about his life straightforwardly, and it puts me at great unease because I just assume that he's about to pull the rug out from under me somehow. That there's some lie coming, that even these really standard stories about his childhood must have not happened, because how could it be the case that he's just going to tell me about his childhood, about what he was trying to do when he started to write music, all of these things that are the most standard pieces of every other rock doc. Here I shift forward in my seat. I'm like, what's happening right now? Is he describing his childhood home?
Is he going to do a Prestige?
What? Where does the trick come in? And it sort of doesn't stop the whole movie.
So you were expecting Rolling Thunder review when you were.
I was just like, it can't be this. This can't be it. So there's a twist coming somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, there's 10 hours of this. Maybe,
Right.
like I said, I don't know. Maybe I'm overestimating. If you really put it all together, how much of actually him speaking it ends up in the movie. Maybe it's 20 minutes. I don't know. Would I gladly pay to watch all 10 hours?
Oh yeah.
Of course. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It breaks my heart that there's 9.5 hours of this that I've not seen. It is like a crime. Maybe it's, I don't know if in Tulsa, if it's on, if they have this stuff, but
I
if
know
they're
they have
showing it,
some of it. I know. I don't know that if they have the Dylan stuff, but I know that they have the Van Ronk stuff. Because
yeah.
recently, but
yeah, but it's not like you can go there and sit there and watch the whole, unedited Bob and Jeff Rosen interviews. Maybe a researcher can, but you can't just walk in and
that's
do
what
it.
I meant. A researcher could.
But it is.
I mean, he comes out of the gate so hard when he is explaining the weather in Hibbing,
Right.
and he explains that they didn't have clothes like we have today. Bob Dylan is describing dressing for the weather, and I'm like, fuck, this guy's got me thinking things I've never thought before. He's right. Somehow this bastard has got me spinning about what it must have been like to be cold in 1950 versus being cold in 2020.
I feel like it's he tells you in one sentence what Robert Caro takes 200 pages to tell you about in Lyndon Johnson, the first Lyndon Johnson book. You get the entire picture in just that. It's incredible. Yeah, it's great. Doesn't seem like the coolest place in the world. You can see why he wanted a GTFO, because it
it's not great.
It doesn't seem great. I don't know. Maybe it's cool now.Maybe it's I don't know.
I was there for research. It's not great.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know. I've never been there. I'm not trying to knock the great
What was the best Bob thing you saw in Hibbing?
I went into the bar Zimmy's, and we sat down to get a beer, my guy and I, and this woman just started talking to us, and she said, well, let me just call Bob's cousin and see if he can come over. And he was busy, and she was like, no, he's busy. And I'm like, that was the strangest thing that's ever happened to me in my life.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if it's. I'm trying to think if it's better
We're
that it
still
just.
friends. She's still cute. We're still friends.
That's great.
Okay, but you had clothes like they have today, so you
Yeah,
you had that going for you when you. I mean, maybe it was summer. I don't know, but
It was summer.
yeah, it does kind of. I don't know that I would want to go there in February. It seems cold. Yeah, what Aaron? What do you think about the character that Bob is playing in these interviews? Because there's always something there.
Or is there? That's
I don't
the
know.
thing that's the thing that haunts me through this
Okay,
movie. I'm
all
like,
right, all
is
right,
he
all right.
not playing a character? Is he? I think
Yeah.
he's not.
There's always an element of performance. I mean, he knows he's on. I mean, I do think that there's an element of performance, but I also think he's in maybe a safe space, so he's not being asked questions he doesn't want to answer. So
Mhm.
to me, when you see him in interviews, and this is post Ed Bradley, well, maybe it's not post Ed Bradley, it's pre Ed Bradley, where he says, I thought the press were people you lied to. But I think the character he's playing is, maybe he's starting to think about his legacy in the 90s, and he's starting to think about, preserving it a little bit. And there is an earnestness there that we don't see. I think, Andy, I wasn't as uncomfortable as you were, Andy, with it. I find him charming. And I think, when he talks about certain aspects, like when he says that he should have let Joan Baez on stage, I think there's something very earnest about that. There's almost like he's correcting past ills in a way. But yeah, I think this is probably, if we think of Bob Dylan as people say, he's not, I mean, he isn't authentic. It's a posture, but this is probably the closest we're going to get, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it is disarming when he says, essentially, like, I made a mistake with that,
Yeah.
with Joan Baez. I was young and I don't know what I was thinking, and it didn't occur to me. Like,
Yeah.
things you don't expect him to, like, he's not a guy who owns up to things, it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't even like seem like that's the way he views human activity. Like the idea that some people make mistakes and sometimes you apologize for things. He like that even seems just not how he views the world.
But I think that us not being able to see that is a protection. And I think this is the most, like I was just saying about the Paris show, where I felt it was completely like, it was just, for me, it was disarming how almost vulnerable he was in that first show. And this is maybe it wasn't as disarming watching the film because I wasn't 4 rows back, but this is, I feel like there's something vulnerable about him here.
I almost imagine, like, let's say my nephew who's 14 or 15, and he's getting into music, he's into film. If I showed him this, because he doesn't know that, I mean, he's probably heard some Bob Dylan songs, he knows,
right.
He's not like a Bob Dylan head. If I showed him this movie and then he goes down a rabbit hole of Bob Dylan, he's going to think we start with, from his perspective, a guy who speaks normally and clearly and has a straightforward account of things, and it just gets weirder and weirder and weirder. Yes. Whereas for those of us who like came to this movie already being deep into Bob, it's the opposite.
Right.
So I almost feel like this movie could, it's almost like wrong to to start off with this movie, because you're just never going to get this again. You're going to be chasing that.
Yeah. Like, yeah, you need to learn about this guy through 90s era internet websites that are themselves unreliable, and they're using quotes from him that are intended to be unreliable. That's how you need to learn about Bob Dylan. I'm sorry, son.
Yeah, or trying to parse the lyrics or something. I don't know, So anyway, but yeah, I mean, there's times when I feel like this reduces him in my estimation, not as an artist or as whatever, but just because it's like, do you really want to see the Wizard of Oz, kind of what, the curtain pulled away? But there still is that element of mystery and of like, why is he not always this guy and this way? And yeah, we've talked through our reasons for it, but it just adds another layer onto the whole Bob situation.
Well, and Aaron's right. He's charming. When he's being an earnest version of himself, he is funny and likable and insightful, and all the things you'd expect from him. They're just all things you don't normally get from him, and at least not like this.
Yeah, I mean, everybody always says, like, if he is interested, like, he can either just completely ignore you, never, you go on tour with him for 3 years, he never speaks, or like, if he locks in on you and wants to speak, that he is the most magnetic and charismatic person one-to-one in the world. And so, and you can kind of see that here, like, oh yeah, that you can see a little bit of that version of the guy
Well,
in there
Joan
as well.
Baez says that she
Mhm,
started
yes.
managing his moods when they were touring, and there were some times that, if he was in a dark mood, you couldn't even talk to him, and he would, but he was still charismatic in his performance because he
Oh,
did
sure.
performances back to the audience, and they would still love it. But the days that he was up and personable, they were great. And so, to your point, that bears out in what Joan Baez says, and I think she's funny in this film.
Oh,
Her
she is.
performance is just
I mean,
brilliant.
talk about charming. She is
Yeah.
very, very, very funny. When she says, like every protest I've ever been to, people ask me if Bob's coming. Like, no, he never comes, moron.
She calls people morons. Yeah.
30 years, he never comes, morons.
Just call
Yeah.
someone else an idiot. Like, oh, you
Yeah.
wrote it, you idiot, about love is just a 4-letter
Yeah.
word.
Yeah, yes, that's right.
Yeah, she's I mean, we did an episode about her documentary with Alison Rapp a few months ago, and like,
Yeah.
she was so delightful. She's just like, a treasure, and yeah. So this is yeah. Every time she pops up on the screen, she's great. But like, I mean, this movie is full of a cast of characters that just
Yeah.
cannot be beat. I'll give it that. I mean, go down the list. Liam Clancy. I mean, you just absolutely feel like you are sitting there drinking a Guinness with this guy while he's just
Right.
spooling off tales.
But
And
also, there's something brilliantly, so quintessentially Irish, because he comes out with these beautiful things like, Greenwich Village was a place you could take your clothes off and you were free from family and free of tradition and lousy
Yeah.
traditions. And you're like, and all of the, gobbledygook he kind of says, like, there are these gems of brilliance.
Yeah. I mean, he has the gift of gab, the
Yeah.
Irish, whatever. And he, he to me represents the sort of oral tradition, the
Mhm.
like, poetry tradition in a way, like not in the sense of like I'm going to sit down and read a poem, but in the
Mhm.
sense of like the time where you could be sitting in a bar and somebody would just spout off a poem, and that was part of life. You know what I mean? And maybe there are parts of the world where that's still the case. I mean, my wife comes from Iran, where I think that is a little bit more. Not that you necessarily sit at a bar. Not that, so obviously people drink, but it's there's not that many bars you can walk into in Tehran. But that where poetry is part of their oral passed down tradition,
Mhm.
more so than most parts of America that I'm familiar. Like that's just not how my family, was, and yeah, and so that kind of poetry, that kind of storytelling, that kind of lyricism, which is so informs Bob. The different people in this movie do a good job of reflecting the different pieces pieces that make up that he pulls from, and Liam just absolutely delivers. He's great. Dave Van Ronk also.
Dave Van Ronk.
I mean, give me that right into my veins.
Did this movie come out before or after he released his autobiography?
I don't know. I haven't read his autobiography. Is it good?
I only know that it is like a famous music book that people say is very good. I haven't read it, but I was wondering if he was as sort of well known as an early Dylan, friend, collaborator in the among people who weren't sickos about this stuff prior to this movie.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I didn't know a lot about him when the movie came out, but I mean, I definitely had heard the name. Like he was just one of the names when they would go through the list of the people in Greenwich Village around that time. He would pop up, and I know like obviously folk heads know who he was.
Sure, right. And then Inside Llewyn Davis comes out like 5 years after this movie or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
7 years after this movie.
Yeah, something like that. So there now there's I'm trying to remember the name of the friend from Minnesota who pops
Tony
up.
Glover?
Yeah, right. Is he the one who talks about how Bob like went to New York the first time and he comes back and all of a sudden like like he had sold his soul at the crossroads,
Yes.
like Robert Johnson, which Bob like has a little fun with. And he talks about how like Bob came back and all of a sudden he was playing guitar so well, and he's playing cross harp, and I was like, wait, hold on. I'm here to tell you, I've never ever heard Bob Dylan playing cross harp, and if he's done it, I'm not aware of it. So a little bit of license with that, in terms of his technical harmonica ability, but nonetheless, again, it's a little bit of a perspective on like what do people from his world think about this guy. And I guess maybe you've been there, so maybe you're more keyed into that, although you did not manage to track down his cousin. But
No.
I mean, it's just got to be wild when like this little somebody comes out of this little town and is such a character, such a like phenomenon. And what does that do to like your whole identity?
Mhm.
Like as a town, or is it? I mean, I think
As a town, as the people that he knew, the people that in his
Right.
life.
I wonder if it's in context of like, because it's such a small town that someone has done something great. And even if you're not, I mean, who doesn't know what Bob Dylan has done? But there's got to be a sense of pride, especially since that town was so, decimated after the iron mine, dried up in essence. And and the town was economically like desolate. So I think that, there's probably a sense of pride from him doing something great. That's it. Who's the other person to come out of Hibbing? It's a baseball player.
Oh gosh, now
I should know this.
my son would probably know.
Yeah,
my
no, but
7-year-old.
I think, but yeah, I think that there's got to be, I mean, also everybody seemed to know everybody when I was there, and just bumping into a woman in a bar, she's like, well, everybody knows this guy, and I know he's passed away since, because I still keep in touch with the woman from Hibbing. Her name is Jane.
Oh, Roger Maris.
That's it.
Roger Maris.
My father's favorite baseball player. Sure.
There you go. It's 61 home runs, 1961.
Yeah. Basically, right when all this was happening.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Exactly.
Exactly. He too goes to New York and does great things in 1961.
Yeah.
Although since Aaron Judge hit 62, nobody remembers who he was, and it's more important that Aaron Judge did it, I guess. So
No, but I mean,
we could do a follow up on this episode on the Billy Crystal movie 61.
Yeah, exactly. Does Bob show up as a character? I've never seen that. I wouldn't be surprised. That would be very Billy Crystal-esque.
Yeah.
But I think, in terms of place, there's definitely a lot of that place. He even says, why is his center in Tulsa? Because he's a Midwesterner. And it just made sense that the heartbeat of America, his center would be in the heartbeat of America.
That's such a Bob thing to be like.
Yeah.
It just makes sense for it to be in Tulsa when I
Right.
grew up in Minnesota and got
where,
famous in New York. It's like obviously it should be in Tulsa. Like what?
Well, the Woody Guthrie Center is there, though. That's the other
Right,
thing is
right.
that he's and that's of course a big part of the movie is the connection with Woody Guthrie, and of course Woody is not in the movie because he died,
Right.
whatever 60 years ago. But you do get a lot of Pete Seeger, who's another great character in Raconteur, and it's just so funny seeing these people who like. I mean, most people who are interviewed in the movie who are musicians or artists are people who, at least culturally speaking, Bob passed them by, right? Like their stars were lined up for a moment, and then he just kept on going and doing his thing. Yeah. And they're, like, I mean, Pete Seeger, like, lived a long life and had quite an interesting life. Like, but he's one of these people who, like, found a kind of groove artistically, and that's just what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't interesting. He wasn't looking to do what Bob did. So it's not a knock on him.
Kind of a badass because he was blacklisted, and
definitely a badass in general, no doubt. I'm just saying, like, in terms of his artistic work, like, I don't know that Pete Seeger went on writing and composing and performing new interesting material beyond that period of time. Maybe there's Pete Seeger heads who are like way into it, but it seems like he basically is known for one thing, and that's what he did, and that's great. And he was
to meet a Pete Seeger head, by the way.
Pete Seeger heads, come on in, drop into the chat here.
I was going to say, hop in our DMs and pick a rock doc. It doesn't have to be about Seeger. You can talk about whatever you want.
Yeah.
Well, Joan Baez has a sort of interesting perspective on this. It's a little bit different, but where she talks about how, like, at one time like the most powerful and well-known songs they had in the civil rights and anti-war movement were from Bob. And it was
Mhm.
clear enough to her that that was the thing he did at that period. And he was just in a constant state of motion. And
Mhm.
it was not unusual to her that he stopped being interested in that, or stopped being, fixated on that, and started doing something else. And that, she was going to sit there and stay interested in that and sort of grow in that world. And so, that's not necessarily getting passed by as much as just like understanding that this guy was a moving target. Or as he describes it, I think right after she says that, he says that he was constantly in a state of becoming.
Right.
And he says that too. And I think what you're that section you're talking about, and we referenced before, Andy, where she says he's not going to show up, you morons.
Yeah.
She makes a conscious effort to get more involved in political activism, and their paths diverge. And so visually in the movie, you see just clips of her doing, political and social activism, and then it cuts to him, and it's an electric set from the 66 tour. And so it's clearly showing how these people who were so connected early on when they were part of the same movement, as they got older, their paths went different ways. And I think we can all identify with people we were with when we were young that were not our life partner. We're like, okay, and that's
For
kind
instance,
of what I
some
got
of
from
them,
that.
some of them might be named Echo. Boy, that's strange. I never knew
Or
another person
Gloria
named
Story.
Echo.
That's
Yeah.
her name. Her real name was Gloria Story.
Oh, that is one of the best moments in the doc, is when he talks about his
His
very
girlfriend.
early girlfriends, and then he like
And they brought
takes a
out the
moment,
poet in him.
yeah, and then he like kind of stares wistfully off into the camera for a moment, and it's just such a great moment.
See,
It is
why
like-
are you disarmed by that Bob? That's such a
It's
great
so-
Bob.
It's so great. Now,
Because it's great. That is what is so alarming about
wonderful. So, okay, let me ask you guys a question, and perhaps you will think I'm a crazy person, but
That ship has sailed.
okay,
Yeah,
fair
yeah.
enough. I mean, a big part of this movie and a big part of Bob's story is that he becomes famous as a folk singer. He writes these great protest songs, which we can go down the list. And he, this is in maybe a 2-year period where he writes like, a vast canon of protest songs. And yeah, okay, maybe Joan Baez was hip at the time to know that this was just a passing phase, or he was just kind of doing what was cool and he was going to move on. But a lot of people saw him that way. And there's people in the film who talk about basically like after he stopped doing that, they lost interest or they were disappointed. We know about the folk festivals and all these things. Okay. So here's my question.
Mhm.
Imagine another world where Bob is convinced in 1963 or whatever by one of these people, like, no, you're a great folk songwriter. You're a great protest songwriter. We have all these things we're trying to change in the world. We need you to focus your powers and your charisma and your skills on doing that. Like, imagine a different direction where he did decide that was what he was going to do. Like, I mean, there's no way to answer this. It's just like counter history. But
Right.
would how would the world have been different? You just have to wonder, right? Like, would he have been
Wouldn't
able
have
to
Blonde on Blonde, Highway 61.
for any of it? Like, if none of that had happened. But I'm saying if
But even
instead,
within this short period of 61 to 66 that we're focused on,
I'm talking about like 63. Like, if whatever. Like, if he had just if he had said, I'm going to use all my powers to be the greatest, to write an endless number of protest songs about whatever's going on in that moment in the world. Like, it's almost like they seem to believe, like, if he had done that history would have been changed, that we wouldn't have had the Vietnam War, that we wouldn't have had, you know what I mean? Like, it's almost like they're convinced that if he had not, the premise is sort of that if he had stayed and just kept on writing protest songs, that he would have the arc of justice would have turned to much more quickly, because he had this unbelievable ability. He was the greatest, and if he'd used those powers for that, we'd be telling a different story about history. And I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, you just kind of make it up. There's no answer, of course, but nobody ever really discusses that it sort of becomes obvious as a fan to go like, well, of course he had to change and he had to go in different directions. But like, I guess I never really thought about that. But like, what if he hadn't?
Yeah. There's another part where there's I can't remember who. Oh, it's one of the early promoters he worked with who says,
Harold
um,
Leventhal.
yeah, Harry
Yeah.
Leventhal, exactly, who says, that he was resentful and he was angry about it, and he viewed it as a commercial decision
Mhm.
to do this. And on the one hand, it is certainly is more commercially viable not to write political music. Obviously, for Bob Dylan at that time, I think that's an accurate observation. And for pick your random pop star today to write a protest song would be a commercially fraught decision. However, there's like a 25, 30-year period where Bob Dylan could have made more money by starting to write protest songs again. Like for Bob
Sure.
specifically, after that period, it actually becomes anti-commercial for him to continue to resist the temptation to do the thing that he's most famous for.
Right. Like if instead of New Morning, he came out with like an album trashing Nixon,
Yes,
people would have gone crazy.
gone crazy. And if instead of Shot of Love, if he's just like, fuck Ronald Reagan, like,
He does do that.
He does
But
in his own way, but
Yeah, but it's
He's
not
not
overt.
dead
I think
kiddies.
that's the beauty of it, is that, performing it,
Yeah,
like,
but commercially,
yeah,
the beauty would be, commercially, what Andy's saying is that he, if at any time he had just,
right.
dropped an album like about, the problem of, acid rain or something in 1987, that
Or
would have been
like,
a big deal.
I mean, I guess you could make the case that like writing Hurricane is him sort of doing that to some
Right.
But
extent,
that's
right?
so short-lived. He only plays it
Yeah.
from October 75 to January 76, and that's it. I mean,
Right. But my point is, like, you could just imagine a counter historical world where Bob continues writing protest songs. He just sticks doing that. Would it eventually have just burned out and he would have been remembered as a guy that had a few great albums in 63, 64, and then he just became another protest singer, like one of these other people that you see in the movie where it's like, oh yeah, they had a great moment. They were really great for a couple of years. Or like, would he have been able to make that compelling if he had just stayed in that lane? And you just have to, I don't know. You can just think about different ways things could have gone.
My immediate response when you started asking that question as I was listening to you was he'd be Phil Oakes.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that was my response, that it would, for me, maybe, and for many people, it would cease to be interesting, that it's just like, oh, here's another protest song about the next thing that we're protesting. And even if the quality of the lyrics and the music was good, it wouldn't be interesting, or it wouldn't be new anymore. I don't know.
Well, he was right all along is what we're saying. I mean, I'm not trying to,
You're not gonna
I'm not anti him going electric or something. I'm just saying, like, it's an interesting way to think about, is like, what if he just listened to these people and said, you know what, you're right, I should protest the next thing.
But like about an hour in, there's this really great point where Dave Van Ronk says that the people were so hungry and they were so jealous of, I'm adding jealous, of Dylan getting signed with Columbia, that they had to make it a moral issue. And he goes on this whole thing about that. And then they cut to 66 tour, and the first word is traitor, and then it's like all these clips of people who are so tweaked by him going electric. And it's like he's been dealing with that, the expectations, and failing to meet people's expectations and defying them, and having to manage that even from the time he signed with Columbia. So
well, and when he has one interview here where on going electric, he it's like he's still all these years later sort of perplexed by it, where he's just like, I mean, country music was electric,
right?
Like, like he's like, I'm still doing traditional things. Like this isn't modern at all,
Right. Yeah. Kind of speaking into that, like his signing with Columbia and stuff. One of to me, the standout stars of this movie is Mitch Miller.
Yeah.
Who was just, I mean, if you've ever seen like old footage of like a TV show from like early 60s with a guy with a goatee, and like they're like, it's a bunch of like neatly dressed white people following the bouncing ball, literally singing along to a popular tune while the little ball bounces and there's the lyrics. Like, that's Mitch Miller. Like, he's that guy. It's Sing Along with Mitch is that show which is like become so parodied that like hardly anybody remembers that the original thing ever exists, or maybe at this point hardly anybody remembers the parodies. But even when I was a kid, I remember that kind of being like a thing you would make fun of. This is corny old whatever, and like he's an A&R guy at Columbia, in addition to like all the other things he's doing in this TV show. It's like right at the same time, and it's exactly what he's doing. The like the follow the bouncing ball thing is when he's like working with John Hammond and kind of not really sure, but he's like, well, John Hammond insisted, and he's pretty proud of the role that he played in Bob's, and him being here to tell this part of the story is so interesting because he's like the quintessential record company, middle America, white, whatever, 1950s ish version of that kind of culture, and his alignment with Bob and what he was doing, and recognition eventually of what made Bob special is really interesting. And also, just one more little thing about Mitch Miller that when I was looking some stuff up is he actually conducted the music with on the Orson Welles' War of the Worlds famous radio broadcasts. He's connected to Orson Welles and Bob Dylan. That alone, he gets some props from me on that. Two biggies.
I think that's something that I found interesting too, that there are a lot of people like Artie Mogul who's sitting there like, well, John Hammond discovered him, but I made him popular.
Oh, yeah, I love that.
That guy, like, come on now. But there are so many people who, like you're saying, have so much pride that they, had the insight or the foresight to look at Dylan and think that he was going to do something. And, where I kind of feel like, maybe Artie Mogul was thinking more about like I could get all these guys to to record this song in all the different ways, like Trini Lopez.
Yeah.
That party of Blowing the Wind always tickles me. But I don't know that it was so, that he was so much a champion for Dylan and promoting Dylan as it was, again, a business decision.
Yeah, Dylan's like kind of the original person who like comes out of the punk scene in a way, and then like goes commercial, but is becomes so big and so popular that it's sort of like undeniable. There's like been since then, like that's almost like a trope that he created, because there was nothing that, I mean, they obviously didn't call it punk, but essentially that's like what we would recognize it as now. The Greenwich Village scene in the early 60s was, like very similar to any punk scene you can ever think of.
And experimental, and
people
no real idea about.
They left their little towns and they're experimenting with sexuality and different ways of modes of living and communal living, and they're poor and they're coming up with music that's like expressing their part of the world, and they're not interested in show business, and they're not interested in commerce and all these things. And he comes out of that and then blows up, and you could think of a million examples of musicians who've come out of that, and then the people from the scene are like looking up and going like, he sold out, or it's great that he, different perspectives on it. But it's like one of the many, many things that he created.
Yeah, right. All of which makes this an understandable period to focus on for a 4-hour Martin Scorsese movie, for instance.
Listen, I get it. I listen. I mean, there's a lot here. I'm not. Oh my god.
Well, I will say, I was wondering if, is this the best or the most complete portrayal of the Greenwich scene? What we have here in this movie, because there's a pretty healthy chunk of this where like we're not necessarily telling Bob Dylan's story, we're telling that scene's story, and we've got all these extra voices, and the movie gets pretty like fast paced and punchy during that stretch where we're like quicker interviews and that sort of thing, and there's a lot of fast cuts to different images on the streets and stuff like that. That's kind of like the funnest stretch of this as far as sort of more modern documentaries that are less interested in being encyclopedic and more interested in being easy to stream while you're like also looking at your phone. This movie like has like that one stretch where it gets to be very engaging, I think.
Yeah, I don't know.
Go ahead.
I don't know if there is another documentary that goes into the folk scene at that level. I mean, I know that it's part of different documentaries, but I can't think of one that is in that level of depth. And like, I don't
And
know
with
that
the
any of
original people actually speaking for
right.
themselves.
Yeah,
you
I
know?
mean, maybe there's a documentary about a Phil Oakes or a Dave Van Ronk that I'm not aware of. Like, it certainly is possible.
Yeah.
Like
There's one
Joan
about
Biden.
Phil Oakes that
Okay,
ironically I saw when I came back from the Minnesota research trip. Yeah, but it's not. I don't. It doesn't have as many talking heads as this one does.
Right.
right. Like there's
Yeah.
not a documentary about that bounces off the Positively Fourth Street book about Joan
Yeah.
and Bob and
I'll let
all that.
David Hay do.
Oh, that's a great book. Highly
Yeah.
recommend it. But yeah, I mean, that's I guess that is sort of like the core of the movie is that
Mhm.
that scene, you know, because the movie goes through 66, but really, I mean, you see the performance with the Hawks, but they're not like there's no interview. Like you'd think Robbie Robertson would be interviewed in this movie because he
Mm-mm.
plays a part in this film,
He's in the
and
car.
he's like Martin Scorsese's best friend, and like, you know, like there's nothing stopping him from being part of this story.
Right.
And Levon was still around. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
you don't Levon Helm is not mentioned. Like the fact that he leaves the tour, but I mean, and I know like every bit of minutia that's interesting to us is not necessarily part of the story, but it really, when you think about it, it does kind of depart. You know, it kind of speed runs at the end through like 65 and the first half of 66,
Right.
in a weird way. So really, the movie is about 61 to 64. Like it's even
Totally.
more narrow
That-
than it purports to be.
I totally agree. I think that there is here's one hit I have on the movie. Early on, the cuts forward to 66 are abrupt.
Mhm.
And almost like almost feel like there's a skip in the DVD player or something, right? Like it is they're not smooth. And then somewhere along the line, and I wrote it down as the one you mentioned where it's a hard cut to people yelling traitor right before Baby Let Me Follow You Down.
Yeah.
Is it starts to come into perspective that he's really building the case for why that tour was so monumental. He's assembling the information like a opening case or an opening statement in a courtroom. And then the jump cuts are just forward are just for effect. And that really continues through the whole movie. Like the 66 never really stops being anything other than a counterweight to what the subject of the movie is, and to help you explain what the stakes are that we're going through early on. We don't get that same level of detail in 66 actually.
The last thing we really get a lot of detail, I think, is Newport 65, right? Like you see him through the different Newport folk festivals and his different, and the treatment of the, you know, I guess we're just never going to really know, you know, like in terms of like Newport 65 and like exactly what happened. I've talked to Peter Yarrow. I know Peter Yarrow, so I've talked to him about it and, you know, trying to get his take on it. But, you know, it's like he's told these stories so many times that it's like, who knows what, you know what I mean? Bob's not going to tell, and he might not even really know like what was going on backstage. Pete Seeger's not around anymore, you know. Like, did he have an axe? Did, you know, all these stories? It's like, I don't know. I guess the movie just treats it as like one of these things where there's different perspectives.
But I thought like John Cohen's explanation about Charlie Seeger's hearing aids bothering him and Pete Seeger getting upset about that, to me, I'm like, that seems like a logical thing that, you know, that would upset me if it was my parent. Maybe.
And
and
just the bad audio, the bad sound.
Yeah.
Is,
so,
you know,
I think that seems logical, but yeah, I think that they didn't. That's the one thing that I love about this, and it kind of goes back to something you said earlier, Andy, is like he's not really trying to, like you said, that it kind of leaves the mystery there through all of this. He's not doing what other biographers do. He's not trying to figure Dylan out. He's trying to present the artist and the evolution of an artist in a way that we understand. Like, here is the moment, and maybe like you were just saying, Dave, that all of this other stuff, why, and maybe it was Andy who said it, I'm sorry, that why 66 is such a counterweight is because this was such a big moment, his creation as an artist, that the evolution away from that, or the movement away from that, felt like a betrayal. to people, and it's really highlighting that original moment. But he doesn't try to figure him out, and I appreciate that.
Another thing
Yeah.
that's interesting relates to that, to like Newport 65 and all, is that the movie barely, if at all, mentions the Beatles. And
just Ginsberg's story, which I have to say I didn't quite understand. But
okay. But what
When he fell in John Lennon's lap,
Lennon's laugh, yes.
yeah, okay, it's Ginsberg, you know.
I just figured they were all really high, and that's why he doesn't remember.
But you know, Newport 65 is July, right? So Beatlemania has already been happening for like over a year in the US. Like the Beatles are almost done touring. So like while the idea of like people going and playing loud music on stage and people reacting to it with excitement may have been shocking to the people in Newport, like for the culture, the youth culture at least, that Bob was essentially part of, he's like 24 whatever. Like, you know, he 23 whatever. He like everything that the Beatles do as a live act in terms of being popular, like, you know, well known in the US at all, is happening. You know, like they're playing Shea Stadium and there's the screaming girls and this, you know, the noise, and you can barely hear the band and blah blah blah. Like, and it is like, okay, maybe you just can't fit everything in the movie, but I always wonder, like, how are people who are attending, you know, these like, you know, buttoned up people attending the Newport Folk Festival in 65, how are they thinking about this at all, if at all, in context of what the Beatles are doing? Because there's like sort of the only comparison.
Yeah.
And
well, I mean, the Beatles are a commodity and they're a commercial, so I don't even think that they consider them as something that they would, you know, lower themselves to participate in, because that's that. I mean, that's why they get mad at Dylan, is because he became commercial.
Yeah.
So the hippest people are also the most square.
Yeah, it's hip to be square.
Yeah.
Far out, man.
I do love the one shot of the billboard right after Bob says like that he's never really thought of a pop chart before, and then he's like, oh, like I think that's exactly how he describes it. Like, I never thought of pop charts before, which I believe. But then they show one, and it's the top three at one point are Help, like Rolling Stone, and California Girls.
Yeah, man,
bangers.
Yeah, imagine living in that moment. Like, what's on the charts?
He's also I thought I've always heard him be a little bit more complimentary to the Byrds and the folk rock thing. He's pretty dismissive of it here. He's just like, people acted like I had something to do with that. I didn't like that at all. He's like, I think he says some band called the Turtles. Like,
yes, he does. Some band called the Turtles.
The Turtles, you knew them.
Catching strays.
Yeah. Like Roger McGuinn, like, it's got to be like, I thought we were friends. Like, Roger McGuinn was down in Greenwich Village, right?
And yeah, not only that, like Roger McGuinn was like almost a Wilbury.
Yeah, I know, right?
He was very good, even up to like right before this movie is made. Now maybe like Bob and Roger had some kind of beef in the mid 90s, you know, some whatever. One of them wanted to buy a Porsche and the other one, you know, whatever. Who knows what these guys' life is like? But yeah, it is kind. I mean, but he often says like he had nothing to do with psychedelia. He wasn't interested in that at all. You know, although he then also wanted to join the Grateful Dead. So as always, the guy's not the most consistent narrator of his own story.
But I mean, I think the wanting to join the Dead, I think he had an incredibly close connection with Jerry, and that might be why. But Roger McGuinn was at the First World of Dylan in 2019, and he played. I mean, he was. So he's still in the orbit. I saw him getting ice in his socked feet. He didn't have shoes on or his hat. We stayed out. We were on the same floor.
Okay.
Oh, he was getting. I see.
Yeah, he was getting ice in his ice bucket.
Right. Yes, he was. Yes, he was filling a bucket of ice. His feet were not being iced like a basketball player. Like after a concert, you got to ice. Roger McGuinn he's got a whole therapy session after.
I don't know.
Anyway,
I also think like we haven't talked about Susie at all, and I love. Susie's very generous interpretation of Bob, and also her recognition that he was a magpie early on, that he would filter everything in and hear something or hear a riff. She said like a jazz riff or a piece of poetry, and it would just become part of what he was doing. I thought she was quite lovely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
ahead.
he doesn't give anything. Like,
Mm-mm.
he doesn't say anything about her, does he?
Mm-mm.
Like, he doesn't, like, he must have known that, like, they're interviewing his old girlfriend who's, like, agreed to
Right.
sit down and talk about this time with him, that, like, she's on the cover of the album. She's, like, a famous part of his story.
Right.
Like, he doesn't even, like, I mean, maybe there's 10 hours of footage. Maybe he, like, goes on for 20 minutes about how cool she was or about the relationship, and they just cut it because it wasn't relevant to the story they were telling. But in the movie, he doesn't acknowledge her. He doesn't, like, whatever. I don't know.
I wonder though if it
Oh,
has to do
definitely.
it's strange because I mean she's obviously in it, so you would think he'd be more compelled to talk about her. But the whole point, if you listen to the interview or read the interview in Rolling Stone from a few months ago about A Complete Unknown, where he says he just wanted to he wanted to protect her memory. That's why
Right.
it's Sylvia Russo in the movie. So maybe that's something he just doesn't want to talk about. I mean, he doesn't mention Sarah at all in the movie.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's.
I mean, she's not going to do an interview because she legally can't. But at the same time, there's no mention of him even having a wife.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. There's parts of the story that want to be told, but also, I mean, that's the thing. Like, it is tempting tantalizing, whatever, to say, okay, well, what does he talk about in the other 9 hours or whatever of footage? Like,
Right.
maybe he does get into these things, and did he decide to leave it out, or what was up to our pal Marty Scorsese? We just, it's an endless set of mysteries.
Release the Peter Jackson cut.
But don't. Oh,
There you go. Come on, please restore this footage, make it in high definition 3D,
Yeah.
and I don't
Gonna be
AI, put AI on top of it somehow.
Yeah.
Release it on all the
Hobbits,
streaming.
whatever.
Yeah.
You know what? Whatever. I'll watch it. I love it.
Yeah. Dylan is Frodo.
Far out.
No, but I think that there's something, I don't know. You could, if you wanted to, fill out an application as a film guy and go look at the film in the archives.
Yeah.
I mean, if anybody has the qualifications to do that, it'd be the host of Rock Docs.
That's
Exactly.
That's true. We could. That's great.
Anyway,
Dave, take Miles on a vacation to Tulsa. You can swing by Louisville. Get the Louisville Slugger.
You could also go to the Tulsa Drillers, the minor league team.
Boom, perfect.
Wow, you guys are really setting up a summer for me. I love it. Then we'll swing by Hibbing, and yeah, let's do it.
But I think ultimately, Dave, I do agree with you that this is for me. My controversial take is that it doesn't cover, if it's an Odyssey, it should cover the Odyssey, where like maybe being in exile in Woodstock is like being with Cersei, and like the 80s are like a tour through Hades, like we're going to hell in the 80s, and like there's an opportunity here to create a whole Odyssey. And then we're not even done, because in Mother of Muses, also Greek mythology, he says, I'm traveling light and I'm slow coming home. I mean, like there's the home narrative that is also woven like lyrically and visually through this entire thing, with Snow going through it up to the end. And so I just kind of feel like I want to see more than this period.
Well, no, I hear what you're saying. And look, in a 3-hour movie, you cannot cover like Bob Dylan's entire life up to 2005 or whatever. I mean, that would be a joke. Right. So, I'm not, if only I just wish that they had framed it a little bit as this is the beginning of the story, not that this is the whole story. It does kind of give you a, like, this is all you need to know thing. And, that's kind of a drag.
With Scorsese coming back and picking the story up again in the mid 70s.
Chronicles 2.
Yeah, we could do a Scorsese could just keep this going. Do like an Irishman level take in the 80s.
Okay, that's a thing he could do.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and now you've got this movie coming out with Timothée Chalamet about this time period,
which is basically this time period, right?
right?
I
Which
mean,
is
it's-
like this story, but with Timothy Chalamet, and I don't know. You know, we'll see. God
I
willing,
mean,
it'll be great.
Do
I
you
guess
have
it's
any?
gonna.
What are your thoughts on it?
Well, we're not going to review it on Rock
Yeah.
Docs because we canonically do
It's
not
not a
review
documentary.
Right.
biopics.
Right.
If somebody
Although we did start with Rolling Thunder Review, which I have to say caused a lot of confusion on the early days of this
It
show.
did. But
Why?
well,
because of all the fictional stuff that they throw in there.
yeah, because it was like we started off with the
This movie that we have
documentary,
to explain,
in
the
some
one,
ways
the,
least
the
like a
one documentary that you need to explain multiple times has fictional elements in it.
Okay,
Yeah.
I have a question, and this is way off topic, but when did you
Please.
know that it was a farce?
Rolling Thunder
I-
review. Oh,
Yeah.
I think it was right. I don't know if it was before I watched it or after I watched it, because
Okay.
I watched it like, either the day it came out or within a couple days. So there was like a lot of media coverage of it. So
Right.
I had either read something about the movie and so I had a tip. I had been tipped off, or the next morning I was vexed and confused and searched for an article and found
Gotcha.
out it was a farce.
yeah. I feel like because I'm pretty sure I watched it the first night. I remember watching it and not knowing.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think the Sharon Stone stuff, I knew enough to know that that timeline did not add up.
Right.
So that was when I started to get like a little bit of a tingle.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until after I was done watching the movie that then I started looking it up, and I'm like, okay, now I see what's going on here. But I had an inkling that all was not exactly as told. But it's Bob, so
Yeah.
I knew enough to know that like once I got that sense, it was like, okay, I see where
Right.
we're going here.
I
Yeah.
knew that he was messing with us in the beginning. The opening credits review splits and it says re/view, and I'm like, there's something going on. And then the Nixon stuff during the bicentennial, I was
Right.
like,
Yeah.
nope,
Yeah.
he wasn't
Yeah.
president.
Yeah,
Right.
And I was
there's
like,
plenty of things where you're
Yeah.
Right. Well, and then I love his line where he says, something like it was so long ago. It's like it wasn't even his life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
See, people dog that movie. It's so good. I love
It's
that
so
movie.
good.
that movie's great.
I agree with you, Dave. It's a better documentary than this one, but that one was already taken. So
Yeah.
I
No,
wanted to put
it's.
something-
I mean, no. I just think like it's a better film. I don't know, in a way,
Right.
like it. But again, I'm not here to trash No Direction Home, Bob Dylan.
Yeah, I mean, there's like great. I mean, there's great footage that you otherwise. I mean, I haven't seen anywhere else.
There's great
some
footage. There's
early
great
stuff,
interviews.
great
All the
interviews.
music is great.
I love all the late '90s kitchens. Like Joan Baez's kitchen might as well have been like one of my neighbors or one of my aunts' kitchens or something around that time frame when I was in that age. Also, it's so nice to have these interviews with all these people,
Mhm.
like when they're still, they were old by this point in the late '90s,
Right.
but they were still young enough to be like super cogent, to have really fresh memories, to be able to express themselves very clearly. And Joan Baez can, she can still speak for herself now,
Right.
obviously,
Oh,
but
I think
they practically, by today's standards, they look young right now, like in this
Mhm.
movie,
I think, yeah, like folks like Al Cooper and then the people that we don't have, because I think
Yeah.
Al Cooper is pretty ill.
Yeah.
And so-
Yeah. Oh God, Al Cooper is so good.
Oh
in
man,
this.
he's got great
Damn.
story. The
Yeah.
whole story of the recording of like Rolling Stone,
Mhm.
that is like
And like sliding into the
for
like,
the
just,
organ.
Like, the organ, like just.
Yeah, and
Bob
you
saying,
hear why.
turn the and Al
And
Cooper.
Tom Wilson's about to say something and like
Yeah.
gets
Yeah.
distracted, so he gets to stay on the organ.
And
Oh my
all
God.
of Al Cooper's stories there, he does an impression of somebody. He does an impression of Bob saying, "Turn the organ up."
That is the unsung hero of this movie. Everyone's Bob Dylan impression. Everyone that does one,
Yeah.
Joan has a great Bob impression.
she really does.
Jones-
She
yeah.
really
She's
does.
like definitely top notch.
Yeah.
I mean,
Unbelievable.
I thought like, could there be a better person to hang out with than Joan Baez? I mean, I know that we said this a million times when we watched her documentary, but
Yeah.
like, she just seems like the smartest, funniest person you could talk to. I
The
think.
only thing you don't get in this movie of Joan Baez is doing any funky dancing.
Yeah,
because-
this is the first Joan
Yeah.
Baez
The Rolling,
appearance without a
Rolling
funky dance.
Thunder, she's doing the funky dancing in her own documentary. There's a lot of it. Underrated as a funky dancer. But
Yeah.
you wouldn't know that from this movie,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
it's true.
But
Yeah.
she is just the coolest person that
Mhm.
that there is, and Bob should consider himself fortunate to have had the opportunity to hang out.
You
with her.
can't be in love and wise at the same time. Bob says
Yeah.
of his mistakes made with Joan.
I'll accept that apology.
Yeah.
If I were her.
She seems cool. She seems cool.
Yeah.
Thing. In the grand scheme of things, I don't. Bob did not cause a lasting scar on her heart. I think she got it out there, diamonds and rust, and she's, she seems to be, she's got his picture over her piano to this day, according to her documentary. So, respect. All right, there's a lot more we could talk about in this film. But Aaron, I know you've been up for many hours, so as you told us. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound like I was just dogging this movie or trashing it. I mean, it's part of the canon for a good reason. I like it. I respect it. There's so much good stuff in here. Do I wish that
encyclopedia?
Do I wish that it was a little bit less PBS-y? Sure, but that's my own personal preference. It's not for me to say.
That's a fair assessment.
I'll say we dog a lot the documentary fallback of, you got to understand, nothing had ever been done like this before.
It's unprecedented.
But if there's a time and place for that framing, it might be Bob Dylan in 1964. Like it. I genuinely, I'm okay, of all the places with somebody to try to explain why you need to care about something, there's a fine place to deploy that, and so for that reason, I'm totally okay with
like Twisted Sister in the Outer Boroughs in 1978. Okay, whatever.
Yeah,
Bob Dylan, 90s. Yeah, sure. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
There's all the superlatives are well earned. So, anyway, Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this film with us. Again,
thanks for finally providing some literary heft to this show of
I
ours.
didn't even get to half of my stuff too. I had pages of notes.
You can, well, Infinity Goes Up on Trial. You can do a special episode where you talk about all the stuff that you wanted to say, but we talked over you.
San Diego and film with you guys.
Come to San Diego and
we are in.
Yeah,
we are
so down. Or maybe we'll meet in Tulsa one of these days. World of Bob.
Let's do San Diego. That sounds so much better than Tulsa.
I mean, we could do both.
I love Tulsa, but San Diego's.
Please come to San Diego. We're here. People, listen. If you're listening, if you like Rock Docs, come to San Diego. We'll hang.
Yeah, that's an open invitation for all the listeners.
I'm sorry, we keep rambling.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Listeners, assuming you're not insane, please hit us up if you're in San Diego. All right. Anyway, Infinity Goes Up on Trial is your podcast. It's very good. It's like really interesting conversations with very thoughtful people, writers and, historians, and really taking interesting perspectives on the world of Bob Dylan, not just like a couple of guys talking about it like we often do. But, really, it's very well thought through, and I appreciate that. So, and it's good. It's a fun listen as well. So yeah, cool. There you go. Bob Dylan, No Direction Home. We did it. Thanks for listening to Rock Docs.
For the first time on DVD, a rare experience with one of the most groundbreaking and influential artists of all time.
We're involved in the same thing, and I knew he was going to be a massive star.
This is how it all began.
Hey, Mr. Tambourine.
Through all of the music.
If there is an American collective unconscious, that Bobby had somehow tapped into it.
The reactions.
He's changed from what he was at first. Don't boo me anymore. God, the booing, I can't stand it.
And the controversies.
These were traumatic times to live through.
What he was writing was inspirational.
From the Academy Award-nominated director of Goodfellas, Raging Bull, and The Aviator, comes the untold story.
An artist has got to be constantly in a state of becoming.
About the early years of Bob Dylan's legendary career on a 2-disc DVD set with bonus features, including never-before-seen footage and rare concert performances.
I had been told about him. This guy's a genius, and he writes these incredible songs. And sure enough, he's everything that they'd said he was.
This is the experience you've been waiting for.
I was born very far from where I'm supposed to be, and so I'm on my way home.
No Direction Home. Bob Dylan, a Martin Scorsese picture. Coming soon to DVD.